This has been such a great pleasure to be here over the last day and a half and to listen to you listening to one another, because this really is the manifestation, you might say, of something new, of a new kind of colloquy here at the University of Montreal. And I have great pleasure to be here. This is just a slide. It is not really a title. I'm not sure I have a title, but I'm taking this opportunity to talk a little bit about what I do and why I do it and what some of the methods are that I employ. And I have to say that in just about every presentation here, I've really learned the ways in which some of the things you're talking about are very much relevant to the things that I work on. And I might also say that this has been a wonderful occasion for me to immerse myself in what I would have to describe as another culture. I didn't know anything about these two solitary, what are they? Two solitudes. And I did know something about the French and the Francophone, Anglophone Quebec, but I think I have never really experienced it as I have in discussion with so many of you. So it's a pleasure to be here in your company as you yourselves are about the business of studying religion and theology and spirituality in the modern university. You work in arts and sciences, and you must look, as I do, from time to time to the fields in the university that are burgeoning, like engineering and statistics and economics, computer sciences, biological sciences. These are the fields that consume the energies of some of our best students. And you no doubt wonder, as I do, how we can get those energies, those brilliant minds, turned to the task and challenge of the humanities in general and the study of religion in particular. We live today in a fast-changing world in which the speed of communication and miscommunication is daunting, in which the production of wealth far outstrips its just distribution. We live daily with the dilemmas of nations and migrations, of homelands and homelessness, of spiritual seekers and asylum seekers. Data is abundant, but insight and wisdom is hard to come by. We human beings are still at the center of the world's dilemmas, with all of our arrogance and ignorance, with all our fearlessness and frailty, with our moments of despair and our horizons of hope. The study of religion is not only important here, but it is complex. It will require the very best of our students, those who go into neuroscience and cancer research, the ones who know the workings of the inside of a computer and know where cyberspace is. Those are the students that we would like to attract to this field. And we as societies are able to target our weapons with almost pinpoint precision to targets on the other side of the world. On the other hand, we don't have much of an idea of what the people on the other side of the world are thinking about. And we're not able to grasp with accuracy how they understand the world on the borderlands of Afghanistan and Pakistan, for example, or in the mire of Syria, or in the barrios of urban Brazil. We're not able to grasp why the energies of many young Muslims are rallied to a strictly Quranic interpretation in their education, and at the same time, how it is that after generations of text-critical and source-critical historical work, so many young Christians, even in my university, embrace a literal and inerrant view of the Bible. How does that happen? Now, Dean Bouchard, when he was introducing the program yesterday, said something that all of us would agree with, which is the tendency that we human beings have to oversimplify experience, the task of reaching into the issues of complexity that the field of religion entails. So what is religious studies in the context of this kind of world? A world with its rivers of change, its whitewater rapids, its oceans and tsunamis. What does the study of religion require of us, and what do these studies have to teach us in this time? It's a pretty big challenge, for the study of religion is, in a way, trying to understand the energies and visions that have created and undergirded and sometimes undermined and disrupted great civilizations and cultures. It means studying the history and diversity of those ways in which people have shaped worlds of meaning in response to or relation to what some may call the transcendent, increasingly in response to science and technology, and in response to other traditions of meaning. It means studying the many ways in which people have given an account of the transcendent, if they have, and the ways in which some traditions and cultures have gotten along quite well without it. It means studying the symbolic, interpretive, scriptural forms over which traditions of faith and practice have argued over the many centuries and continue to argue today. Sometimes people ask, what is a religious tradition? I will say, well, it's a long historical argument over certain things that each tradition wants to argue about. And it means studying as well the very vocabulary that we use, meanings of words like religion and tradition and theology and spirituality and secularism. This is part of what we do. We argue and think about what those words really mean, and when we come to some nuanced understanding of it, we actually might go on using it. This is part of the irony of it. But this is the task and the challenge that Alain Guignac emphasized yesterday in introducing things, the bridge building between and among our ways of approach. And the more that we realize that we are feeling out parts of an elephant, the closer we might come to an outline. From the perspective of history, it means studying the ways in which these worlds of meaning have intersected, interacted, separated, converged, sometimes collided through centuries. And it means studying the ways in which this all goes on happening today, for the history of religions isn't over. It is happening before our very eyes. It's dynamic, ongoing, full of the turbulence, full of the ongoing interpretation, argumentation, adaptation, criticism, self-criticism, even as people who claim different worlds of meaning battle it out, compete for power and resources, as they encounter people of other traditions, as they encounter worlds of meaning called biophysics, neuropsychology, nationalism, and secularism. From the perspectives of anthropology or sociology, it means looking at our communities, our tribes, our nationalities, our nationalisms and tribalisms in the ways that Durkheim called the collective effervescence of the group that shapes our identities and loyalties and boundaries and rivalries. And we don't have to stick to an analysis of those things we call religions. If we bring this analysis to the great religious phenomena of our time, we might be tempted to look at sports, for example, or entertainment, or the spectacle, all of which are part of what one might call the pseudo-religious behavior of our society. I think it would be too grandiose to say that the importance of the study of religion is greater than ever, but it is true that religion is increasingly in the public view as a matter of practice, ideology, vision, conflict, and in the dawning of the 21st century and the post-9/11 events, people in a wide variety of fields are becoming urgently interested in religion as they become ever more aware of the power of religion in their own societies, a power that is evident for better or for worse. And we recognize this actually in many of our own colleagues. I do in for example, the government department. They're intensely interested in religion, but they don't actually have very much training in what to think about. We need to be in dialogue with them. And we need to take account as we begin of who we are and where we begin. For some of us, And for many of our students, the study and interpretation of religion means grappling with one's own tradition of faith and interpreting that faith in the context of the world today. Or it might mean grappling with one's own ideological commitments and similarly interpreting that in the context of the world. For some, it may mean taking as a matter of scholarly understanding and scholarly intention to look at worlds of meaning that are not one's own, and that can be very threatening for many people. And for others, it may mean approaching the whole spectrum of human religiousness with the skepticism of a secular worldview. So, how do we take account of where we begin? And that's where I will begin today. My own intellectual trajectory in the study of religion began, I suppose, with my own tradition, Protestant Methodist Christianity, growing up in the mountains and plains of the American West, and that was the tradition I knew. It was a kind of social gospel Methodism that was deeply concerned in those days with civil rights and human rights for all people, and that became deeply divided, as American Protestants and other Christians did, over America's conflicts in other parts of the world we knew almost nothing about. And in those days, it was Vietnam. And as the decades rolled on, it was Iraq and the Middle East, and more broadly, Somalia and Libya and many other places. And it was out of the turbulence originally of my own faith and tradition that I set off as a student to study in India, and as a consequence of that study, to become a student of religion. I should say that my first mentor in the study of religion was a Canadian, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who founded the Institute for Islamic Studies here at McGill. And the first book I pulled off the shelf when I entered graduate school at Harvard was his book, The Meaning and End of Religion, which I presume most of you have read, a study of the ways in which the very term religion is inadequate to the study of religion, that it doesn't really correspond to anything in the various religious communities that people are talking about. The categories and frames of reference that we in the Western Academy brought to bear are not generally applicable, nor universal, to be sure, but quite particular. He would have been wholly in agreement with the observations of our scholars of China yesterday, for example, that religion is not a conceptual category that belongs there, but then neither is it applicable in the language worlds of many other religious traditions, in Hindu or Buddhist India, nor in what we came to call Judaism or Christianity. Smith was, in a sense, a deconstructionist before the name was attached. Not only did religion fall into his area of critical study, but we would add other terms as well. Secularism, for example, as Solange Lefebvre and others have pointed out. This also is a contested term. It is not, it does not have any natural meaning, and it means very different things in different contexts, and certainly in different cultural contexts. Another of my mentors, an Indian scholar of religion, who actually is an anthropologist, but was head of a department of economics in Delhi. I mean, this is the way the arbitrary nature of our fields is somehow laid out in different places, but his name is Trilokinath Madan, and he looks to Dharma as the most important category in Indian thought, a concept that does not map well onto the idea of religion, but he says almost every Hindu, Jain, Buddhist, or Sikh, even if he's illiterate and of humble origin, knows that Dharma is the foundation of good life. It doesn't mean that this meaning is easily conveyed in non-Indian languages. It's broader and more complex than the Christian notion of religion, and less jural than our current conceptions of law or duty. It emphasizes awareness and freedom, rather than the notion of religio or obligation. So conceptual categories are among the first things that we must take seriously as students. we must understand gradually and in colloquy with people who are in different fields of study than our own, with different language capabilities, we must understand how we use them and where they are wholly inadequate. And Smith went on to investigate ways in which conceptual categories such as belief and faith and tradition and scripture must be questioned as ways of approaching the wider realms of what we have come to call the religions. And also, by the way, challenge the very names of the religions, names that most of them do not apply to themselves and scarcely recognize. And they are not traditions that are somehow confined within their own riverbanks as Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, what we're used to seeing as chapters in a book, as if they were just chapters in a book. This is not the way in which they are largely seen by participants in those rivers of faith. And historical study means digging into the roots of things, the sources, the beginnings, but it also means following the springs of living waters that emerge, understanding that origins and beginnings are only one aspect of historical study. As Smith often said, time's arrow is pointed the other way, and the history of religions is not over. At our present context, the U.S. and Canada, virtually anywhere in the world, makes it manifestly clear that the religious life of humankind is changing before our eyes, as migrations and communications have changed the face of the earth. So now I'm going to go, this is my interim slide, by the way. If you want to rest your eyes on a Montana sunset, that's it, the big sky country. And I'm going to go to the first chapter, so to speak, the chapter that concerns my first intellectual endeavor. I have a habit of selecting fairly large questions and not backing away from them, much to the consternation of many of my colleagues. But for all of us, we start in particular places with the projects we choose and the questions we ask and the challenges those questions pose, because religion is not a discipline in an ordinary sense, if there is an ordinary sense. It is a subject of study, an approach to which is inherently multidisciplinary. And my questions were about a city, the city of Benares, also called Varanasi, on the banks of the Ganga in India, a city known to Hindus as Kashi, the city of light. I went there as an undergraduate. I continued to go there over the course of many years, doing doctoral research and eventually writing my first book about this city. I read what I could when I first started out. The books I found written in English as a young student were written largely by missionaries who described the city as a place wholly given over to idolatry and the heartbeat of paganism. I thought eventually that I could do better, and so I went and spent some time living in Benares and reading the Sanskrit texts that praise the temples and the ghats of the riverfront, the myths and the tales told of the gods, and indeed the histories that describe the eras of prosperity and destruction in a city that was very, very old. In Benares, there were plenty of ruins to visit and temples built again and again on top of ruins. And that also meant reading what I could of what we might call the theologies of this place, expressed in the language of the spiritual benefits that might come from visiting. It is a place that also had a different vocabulary to which I was introduced. It was called a tirtha, a word which means literally a ford, a place where you can ford the river, a spiritual ford as well, a ford where one can perhaps cross to the far shore. Again, some of the language that is used to describe the far shore, the summum bonum of one's spiritual quest, the far shore of immortality. In my first project, I took as my task to try to understand what this tirtha meant and continues to mean for the Hindus for whom it is meaningful. Those who come to this place as spiritual seekers and pilgrims over the centuries, those who continue to come today, some of them once-in-a-lifetime pilgrims, some who come to live out their lives in a place that they affirm will bring liberation at the time of death. Some come bringing the ashes of their beloved dead to the Ganges here. And this, of course, meant also talking to people, hearing their voices, asking questions, and being asked questions by them, refining what I was able to ask by the reflective experience of those I entered into conversation with. The city is also filled with temples and shrines. Who are these gods? Why so many of them? Why does each have so many forms and names? Why are they given form in images? What do the images themselves mean? What is the meaning of offering flowers and fruits and water and incense to these divine forms? These are, to be sure, the kinds of questions of an ethnographer who is interested in ways of religious life, in ritual life. But they're also theological questions, and they involved exploring the ritual grammar of a culture distant from my own, from my rather simple Protestant roots, where we had nothing of this sort at all. And then there was the river Ganges, the great stone ghats that bring pilgrims by the countless numbers to the shores of the river every day. They stretch out along the riverfront for miles, bathing ghats and neighborhood laundry ghats and cremation ghats that all bring people into the sacred river to bathe. So how is this river understood? The river of heaven, they call it. The river that came to earth to bring life to the ashes of the dead, to give life in abundance. A liquid form, they say, of the goddess, of Shakti. The story of her descent to earth is well known by Hindus. She was implored by the asceticism of a sage named Bhagirath to come to earth from heaven to raise the ashes of his ancestors. Their salvation could only be accomplished by the waters of this heavenly river. And so the penance and the prayers of the sage began, and when she had agreed to fall to earth, Shiva was then implored to catch the Ganga in his hair in order to cushion her torrential fall, lest she shatter the earth with her power. Ganga fell to earth, was trapped in the coils of Shiva's hair, rolled out over his head and his body, and then, so they say, Bhagirath led the river down the mountain terrain and out upon the plains of India. So what is the religious significance of this river? From the daily rituals of bathing to cremation rites, the river is literally the theater of Hindu religious life, not only in Benares, but throughout India. Granted, there are innumerable temples and wayside shrines, but the Ganges and other sacred rivers are India's great cathedrals. They are more important in that religious life than any of the temples built by the patronage of kings. And then there are the cremation grounds, like this one at Manikarnika, where people bring the dead for cremation. So my first book was really an attempt to work out in my own way what this tirtha means to the Hindus who have cherished it over the centuries. My methodology? Well, it had to be interdisciplinary because there was history that was embedded in some texts and more realistically in texts that bordered on mythology, the Puranas, as they're called, the old stories. And there were these texts, many of them the Puranas, that had long sections on kings and legends and myths and this temple and that temple. How did all of this map onto the city today, for example? How did the texts I read, some of them 1,000 years old, have any relevance to the city at my feet? Did people even know the myths and the legends of these temples? Did these temples even exist today? The ones that are described so precisely north, south, east, and west in the sacred literature of the city? Were there people who still came here to live out their lives until they died, in the faith that their death would bring liberation? Were there hospices for the dying? And what about the river? Did people recoil at the visible pollution of this river of life? There were, of course, too many angles. No single line of inquiry would do. So finally, how did I do? Well, the truth is, I'm not sure I know. Many people would argue with even the intent to undertake this kind of project, to try to understand how something that is very important is important to someone else. That, to me, is at the heart of the humanities, but it's not an easy thing to do. What I do know is that a gathering of the scholars and the literati and the religious leaders of the city came together after the book was published and held a symposium. I gave an address in Hindi explaining what I had tried to do, and I heard one person after another, including the patron of the event, the Maharaja of Kashi, praise the book. And one after another, they said they could not quite believe it had been written by someone who was not a Hindu. And they realized I was not a Hindu. In any way, I realized for myself that no Hindu would have written the book that I wrote in quite the way that I wrote it. But methodologically, I did carry within me a sense of the task of the humanities, you might say, imparted by Wilfred Cantwell Smith, that what we write should be recognizable by the people about whom we write. It might be illuminating to the people about whom we write. It doesn't mean they have to agree with it, but they should recognize it. And that, to me, is an important keynote of our study, to write something that is understandable in at least two communities. Our complex community of critical study and the community of people equally complex, we'd have to say, of those about whom we write. A few years later, well, I kept receiving letters about this for people who could actually write them, but I got a letter from a gentleman in Calcutta who said this, among other things: I believe you have been destined by Lord Shiva to perform this task, and that it is Shiva who gave you that perseverance and patience through so many years of your toil. So that asked another set of questions. Who am I? I don't pray waist deep in the Ganges as this woman does, but I recognize that what she is doing bears some relationship to what I call prayer. And what did I think about Lord Shiva and his vocational call to me? How did I think of that? So my intellectual trajectory from Benares really led in two directions, and I'll mention the first, and that is a different set of questions. Not so much what does Kashi, this city, mean to Hindus, but what does it mean to me? Not only this city, but my studies in general. What about Lord Shiva? After all those years in Benares, I didn't somehow leave my own perspectives and my faith somewhere else. They were still with me, even as I tried to enter into another vocabulary of faith. The dialogue within was very much alive. Not what the intellectual dialogue of comparative studies in general means for the study of religion, but what it means for shaping, reshaping, and understanding the language of my own tradition. So how do I understand the God language of my own tradition? How do I understand what people refer to as the universal providence of the one I call God in creation? What is the meaning of Christ, whom Christians and I myself speak of as present with us, God with us, even now, not just then? How do I understand the freedom of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit that is represented by the flame, by fire, by the wind, the bird, the breath, which, like the wind, we are told, blows where it will? Does it blow over here? And what does it mean to speak of salvation, liberation? And what about spiritual discipline? The Buddhist, the Hindu practices of meditation that are aimed at stability of mind, the stability of mind that eludes so many in the maelstrom of our active lives. Clearly, the dialogue that produces new relations with the people among whom we live and whom we study also precipitates a dialogue with the terms and visions of our own intellectual and spiritual traditions. If we are people who live within a family of faith, it requires us to think anew about it. How is a Christian theological stance shaped by a dialogical encounter with other faiths? And how about that dialogue within ourselves, the inner dialogue that Hannah Arendt calls that solitary dialogue that we call thinking? So in the years following my Benares work, I also was invited and participated as a relatively young Protestant Methodist in some of the ecumenical work of the World Council of Churches, namely its working group on dialogue with people of living faiths and ideologies. We met also with people from what was then called the Vatican, it's changed names so many times, but the Commission on what was it called now, Patrice? For interreligious dialogue. Anyway, it participated with us as well, and we'd meet one year in Geneva and the next year in Rome. And I worked with many people from churches, largely churches of Asia, Africa, Latin America, to see more clearly how Christians might be engaged in community with Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim neighbors, how we might better understand not just the ritual and social forms of our neighbors, but their faith. What is it that brings their life together, by which they live and envision the future and die their deaths? Inevitably, how do we understand our own faith in light of the religious claims of our neighbors? Now, W.C. Smith was a careful and fastidious scholar of religion and of Islam in particular, having lived in Lahore in the period before partition. He was also a deeply thoughtful Presbyterian, a layperson for the most part, and a theological thinker. When he came to Harvard to teach in 1961, he challenged the divinity faculty with an important question in its inaugural lecture that remains a question for all of us today, especially those who would dare to do theological thinking. And that is this: from now on, the articulation of our faith must take into account the world of religious vibrancy and intellectual depth that the study of the world's religions reveals. I don't know how our theologians will contend with these questions, but I do know that from now on, these are the questions with which we must contend. A new theological thinking that takes seriously the fact that serious thinkers, philosophers, whether they call themselves theologians or philosophers, have been grounded in Muslim and Hindu and Buddhist traditions of thinking. No longer will it be all right to live in the silo of the Western canon. He was right, of course, and more than 50 years later, the world of theology has changed, and religious pluralism is not only the practical study of societies and nations, but the challenge of religious people, of theologians in every tradition, not simply from the point of view of their lives as citizens of this nation or that, but from the perspective and in the language of their own faith. Does the serious encounter with other ways, other worldviews, other worlds of meaning destabilize one's own? Does it threaten one's own? Does it relativize one's own? Does it enrich one's own? How do we respond to that? I was telling someone yesterday about, it was during these years that Pope John Paul II had sponsored this great day of prayer for peace at Assisi, and he was, in his own way, a very important sort of advocate of the dialogue of religious thought. And as the day of prayer approached, the Vatican issued a little sort of corrective on what was to happen. They said, "We come together to pray, but we do not come to pray together," with the sense that we can't actually pray together. We don't know that. I think we can't do that. People are feeling a little apprehensive about that. We will come together, and then the Protestants will go here, and the Catholics there, and the Jews there, and the Muslims to their place, etc. But that question of how we understand and value the religious other, however we put that, crudely put, are other religions true in our view? Is our religion alone the one that has the deepest roots of truth? Is no religion true? And there certainly would be Marxists and others who would say none. But the way I pose this question makes it clear that even those who are ardent atheists and have no religious affiliation whatsoever have an ideological view of religion and the diversity of religious traditions. And diversity is not just a simple fact, it is always an interpreted fact. So I said that there were two ways of proceeding out of the work that I did in Benares, and one of them led me into this whole world of interfaith encounter, both within the Council of Churches and also, I might say, in those days, with the sort of the kind of stormtroops of the Vatican Catholic interfaith encounter that was the intermonastic encounter that brought monastics together from Christian and Buddhist and to some extent Hindu communities as well. And I was kind of the token Protestant when that intermonastic encounter met at Assisi, the site of the life of Thomas Merton. So that was one of those ways out of Benares. Now let me just check for time here. I think we only have a couple more hours, right? I want to talk about the second one, which has involved taking a much wider look at India and some of the issues of what constitutes national, if we use nation in quotes there. What constitutes a sense of national belonging? How do people imagine their collective identity? And Benedict Anderson's famous work in which he talks about imagined community became sort of instigating here an analysis that I'm sure is familiar to many of you who live in this imagined community of Quebec. It has a lot of relevance. But one thing I gradually realized in my research in Benares was something that most Hindus already knew, that this sacred city, as important as it is, doesn't stand alone as a great center of pilgrimage, but is part of an extensive network of tirthas that stretch throughout the length and breadth of the land. Indeed, the very names of the temples and the ghats in Benares are derived from this broader landscape. This is a place called Kedarnath in the Himalayas, up about 14,000 feet, and its sort of pair is one of the temples along the Ganges in Benares, also called Kedarghat. Indeed, the names of Kashi and its great Shiva temple of Vishwanath are also found in duplicate in other places in India, north, south, east, and west. So I began to realize that the entire land of India, I hadn't really thought of this before, is a great network of pilgrimage places. Referential, interreferential, ancient, modern, complex, ever-changing. Kashi, I began to realize, is not the center like Mecca or Rome or something like that, but one of multiple centers in a polycentric landscape linked together with the tracks of pilgrimage. Each part of it made sense only in relation to the whole. And the instigation, a part of it comes, of course, from my own foolish curiosity, to find out how these parts are actually related in their networks of pilgrimage tracks. And mind you, pilgrimage in India today is as vivid a phenomenon as it is anywhere on earth. There are literally millions of pilgrims this very day who are making their way into the mountains to the headwaters of the river, that was the headwaters of the Ganges there, headed for these tirthas in the mountains, at the river banks, along the hilltops everywhere, whether they're on foot or train or bus. This is still the most important reason that people travel in India, from the high mountains of the Himalayas to the tip of southern India, where the three oceans come together. Now, this project, as you might imagine, took a very long time, and it took me to a multitude of Hindu tirthas, from the sources of the river Ganga in the Himalayas to the headwaters of the other great rivers of India, the Narmada, the Godavari, the Kaveri rivers. I climbed to hilltop goddesses, a few of the 51 network of hilltop goddesses around the country that constitute the power places of the Devi. And I made my way to many of the great shrines of Shiva, like this one, on an island in the Narmada River, especially those places that are said to be the 12 places of his great lingas of light. And in this wider network, I found that there's nothing really that stands isolated. Each place is part of a living and storied and connected landscape, shaped not by its unique figures, but by the duplication and repetition of its features, and as a whole, constituting a sacred geography as complex as the whole of the subcontinent. This led me to thinking a lot about what we map as our own world view, the lived-in map of the world of meaning that we inhabit, something much more complex than the Google Maps that can be seen from space, but the worlds of meaning that include the landscape, the peripheries and borderlands, the centers and mountaintops, that are part of the imagined landscape of cities and towns and countries the world over. And that landscape becomes a kind of cultural knowledge, and it certainly is in the case of India. I gained an entirely new sense of what the land of India means for Hindu India, and I gained an equally sort of disjunctive sense of how it is that for Muslim India, with all of its shrines of martyrs and the dargahs of saints and martyrs, this becomes a very different landscape. But in a sense, the question is raised that we face the world over, that we live in the same place, but we don't think of it in the same way. A study it was that involved a lot of old texts and popular pilgrimage pamphlets and maps and images and local presentations in relation to the wider landscape. And that book sort of stretched throughout the entire decade, really, of what I have just been talking about in relation to the theological work. Here, one of the great images of Shiva and his 12 holy places cast upon the map of India. And this sense that pilgrims themselves, from the time they set out from home to the destinations that they reach, actually begin to create links in this landscape with their very footsteps. So interdisciplinarity, part of what I've been doing, but probably nothing was as demandingly interdisciplinary as my very last project on India, and that was the Kumbh Mela in 2013. Interdisciplinary is a term that we invoke as sort of the way in which we work across the fields of the humanities or social sciences, philosophy, theology, history, anthropology, etc., many of which seem in a way like arbitrary boundaries. But I discovered a more radical interdisciplinarity in this project, looking at the greatest pilgrimage of them all, the Kumbh Mela, which takes place every 12 years at the place where the Ganges and Yamuna River join, that confluence, the Sangam, where they actually join a third river seen as a spiritual and invisible river, the Saraswati. The ancient name for the place is Prayag, the great place of sacrifice, renamed Allahabad by the Mughal Emperor Akbar in the 16th century. And there is the pilgrimage that brings literally millions upon millions of people. Over the course of a month and a half, 125 million people in 2013. On the great bathing days, 25 million people who come to bathe in the Sangam of the rivers and to have the darshan of the saints, the sages, the ascetics who encamp there, and who encamp there literally by the tens of thousands for this entire month. Most people see ascetics in kind of a solitary way, and it is seen as a great beneficence to be able to encounter and have what they call the darshan, the sacred sight of these people who have literally renounced the world. And in the Kumbh Mela, there were about 200,000 of these ascetics, the privileged babas, as they're called, the sadhus, the Naga babas, the sannyasis, the renouncers, and they have the first rites of bathing on the 3 or 4 great bathing days and plunge into the river at the very moment of its most auspicious time. So here was a project that made sense completely to me, that it would be really interesting to go to the 2013 Kumbh Mela. But the truth is, I had no idea what I was really getting into, and then joined with a colleague, an architect and urban planner from Mumbai who teaches at the School of Design at Harvard, to think about what it would mean for an interdisciplinary team to study this remarkable event. What about the engineers who put together those 18 huge pontoon bridges? What about the, these are wrong. What about the whole area of urbanism, where creating a tent city on this floodplain of the rivers is undertaken every single, well, to some extent every year, but in such a vast extent, every 12 years. What about the issues of business and commerce? What about technology and the cell towers and the ways in which one could track what was happening with the influx of pilgrims through phone calls? And what about public health? The fact that this gathering of so many people, this mass gathering, many times as large as the Hajj in Mecca, poses challenges for public health and becomes the possibility of the epidemic. So we had people here from all of these various branches of the university, from business and governance, from public health, and from urban planning. And here is the challenge. If you see this sandy wedge of land where from the north the Ganges comes down, from the west the Yamuna River flows in, and during the period between about November and the second week in January, a city of that will house at least 6 or 7 million people overnight is constructed. Constructed literally out of 5 things, out of rope and tent and tenting and bamboo and corrugated steel and nails. And the ways in which our urban planning colleagues conceptualized this were astounding. They did not ask the same questions I asked, but the challenge and sheer human achievement of creating the complex infrastructure of the Kumbh city of some 19 square kilometers, 2/3 the size of Manhattan, on a dry floodplain that opens up literally 6 weeks before the whole thing begins, is astonishing, with roads and bridges and power stations and electricity and 43,000 toilets of various sorts. All of this raising questions that I, as a religious scholar, had not really ever thought of, although I certainly should have. They were not my own, but working with this interdisciplinary team brought essential insights to the whole issue of pilgrimage. And so I think we can ask ourselves, what are the big projects that we could work on as religious scholars that involve people from across the disciplines? So another interlude here. One of the great changes that has taken place in what I call the new geo-religious reality of the world today has been the massive movements of people and as both immigrants and refugees. Refugees alone amount to something like 70 million people. And for the world as a whole, especially for Europe and North America, this is a humanitarian crisis of the utmost significance. But let me think of it from another perspective as well. The global movement of peoples has also transformed our societies, and we know this as Americans from the U.S. or from Canada. And we are wrestling with new levels of religious diversity that pose both civic, legal, and theological questions for us. In the U.S., the immigration of the past 40 years, since the passage of the American Immigration and Nationalities Act in 1965, has really transformed the demography of my own country. And it has created a living bridge between, you might say, my 2 research sites, between India and America. South Indian Tamil and Telugu Americans construct temples in suburban Nashville and Kansas City. They fly home to Chennai for a family wedding. They import sacred images from the workshops of Mahabalipuram. Indian scientists in the Silicon Valley check their cricket scores on their cell phones. Gujaratis hold their garbas in rented VFW hall. They build enormous temples like this great temple in Pittsburgh, but duplicated literally in dozens and dozens, perhaps by now hundreds, of cities in the United States. And certainly you recognize this from Canada. The Sikh Coalition documents discrimination against Sikhs and meets with the National Transportation Safety Board about travel restrictions relating to turbans and kirpans. Indeed, it's a new world. And when I began my own work in India, it was a world that I didn't yet know. It was beginning to evolve before my very eyes. And I discovered it first through the fact that the children of the new immigration came to college in the late 1980s and early 1990s. I launched the Pluralism Project in 1991 to find a new way of studying this religious reality and of reading American history through the lens of its minorities, beginning, of course, with the fact that there was a vast diversity of Native people in the U.S. and Canada long before the Europeans came, and, of course, those who began to settle in places like Boston sought religious freedom for themselves, but they never imagined that religious freedom might be the foundation of a society of people different from themselves, of a complex society. And that was a long time coming, realizing that they didn't have to create a Christian Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that eventually Jews and Catholics would come to live there, though with some resistances, eventually Muslims and early Buddhists. And the colleagues who studied all this, who studied immigration, were largely sociologists, but they paid no attention to religion. The colleagues who studied Islam and Buddhism paid no attention to speak of to American Islam and Buddhism. And as for political science and legal scholars, in the 1990s, the church-state issues had not yet raised themselves to the position where they had litigation in the upper levels of our courts. But there were lots of encounters. And in the 25 years since then, the Pluralism Project, with the help of students and colleagues across the country, has taken as our research agenda the dynamic life of religious America in our time, asking first the kind of questions that demographers ask, who's here, but we're not demographers. So this was sort of, who's here in Boston, if we can recount the number of mosques and Hindu temples, gurdwaras, Buddhist communities, new Christian churches, African, Latino. Second, how are these religious traditions changing in this new environment? Because we know our religious traditions change all the time in relation to new contexts and in the encounter with different people. And third, perhaps most important, how's America changing as we begin to appropriate this new religious reality in the diverse ways in which even our founders probably could not quite imagine, even as our Muslim congressmen like Keith Ellison take their oath of office on a copy of the Quran that was owned by Thomas Jefferson, even as Tulsi Gabbard, here our first Hindu congresswoman from Hawaii, placed her hand on the copy of the Bhagavad Gita she had carried as an officer in Iraq when she took her oath of office as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. So this growth of America's religious diversity has taken place slowly in countless local ways, the stories of which need to be collected one by one, that become the primary sites, you might say, of a new phase of American history that not very many people were paying attention to. The Knights of Columbus Hall in Cambridge, for example, became eventually the Islamic Society of Boston and the Islamic Society of Boston Cultural Center here, one of the great landmark mosques of the entire Northeast. But I want to be clear that this is not just about real estate and the snapshots of religious communities, because behind every Vietnamese temple that is living in a garage and behind the garage door, and behind every church that has been converted into a temple, behind every newly built mosque, there is the story of a community encountering an American neighborhood, bridging somehow the place from which it came and the place it now inhabits. And those local histories, mostly unwritten, are the very things we need most to know as we document this chapter of American history. So let me conclude by just asking that question, how are we doing? I myself, by the way, entered into this work and tried to write a book. It's called A New Religious America, that is basically an invitation to people who don't go to the places that I go to come and visit the Hindu rites of bathing the great granite image of Vishnu on a Saturday morning in Boston, or the Buddhist observance of the Buddha's birthday, or an Islamic center in Queens that has a full-time Islamic school. And writing in that period of time, the 5 years before 9/11, I also discovered a lot that was very destabilizing and difficult. The gangs of the so-called dot busters in New Jersey, who beat and even killed Hindu immigrants, and the vandalism of a Hindu Jain temple in Pittsburgh, where the images of the deities were smashed and the word leave written across the altar, or the desecration of a Cambodian temple in Maine, where the Buddha Hall was vandalized and the contents of the whole temple strewn around the yard. So if we ask how we are doing in this new religious America, how is America changing, there are clearly lots of tensions. There are new neighbors like the San Diego Atonement Lutheran Church and the Islamic Society of San Diego that actually share a fence and share a lot of tensions, especially as it became clear to the Lutherans that one of the 9/11 pilots had actually been a member of that Islamic Center. On the other hand, in Fremont, California, in the Bay Area, the Islamic Society of the East Bay and the Methodist Church bought property together, named their access road Peace Terrace, and started building together. This was 20 years ago. So the longitudinal study of these two communities is an important part of the history of Fremont. One of the things that we have done in the past decade, and I'm just going to conclude briefly with this, was to develop a new pedagogy for this, a pedagogy that enabled students to place themselves in the position of those who are engaged in these kinds of encounters. A thick description of a conflict or a dilemma with a protagonist and a context, with some decision points that students are asked to entertain. And the first might involve this fellow. His name is Jeff Young, a superintendent of schools in Cambridge, who in his very first year as superintendent received a request to add the Muslim holiday of Eid to the school calendar, either Eid al-Fitr or Eid al-Adha, depending on which falls in the week during a given school year. Now, Jeff, like most superintendents of schools, considers the calendar to be the bedrock of the school. I mean, people post it on the refrigerator. And he was trying to choose his battles. He had just come to the job. Is this what I really want to do? He said. Is this a battle I want to pick? He thought of parents who would be inconvenienced by another day off. He thought of the unions who had contracts. He thought of the social justice question. What did he need to know about Eid? When is it celebrated? Would this be a slippery slope? Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur for the Jews, Good Friday for the Christians, Eid al-Adha, Eid al-Fitr. What about the Hindus, the Buddhists, Diwali, Chinese New Year? How would this continue to evolve? Now, that's not a unique question in the Cambridge School District. It is a question on the plate of virtually every school district in the United States. So that places the question on the plate of our students. What should he decide? Or how about Tom Farrell, who is the superintendent in Aspen, Colorado, who decided that he would launch a yoga ed program to enrich the physical education program in the schools. When an elementary principal met with him, he thought it was a good idea. The program had been developed in California. They said it improved academic achievement, physical fitness, emotional intelligence, and stress management. What should he do? Who wouldn't want this, a benefit for students' health and performance, especially for those little kids who just run around and have too much energy? Wouldn't this be a good thing? And so it was instigated, and within a few days, he received pushback that there were people in Aspen who thought of yoga as a kind of four-letter word, loaded with a highly debated history and culture and meaning. Is it religious? Is it Hindu? Is it just exercise? Or is there something to the fact that this kind of exercise transforms the psychophysical organism? The founders of the program insisted it was not religious. They stripped away everything, the namastes, the asanas, everything that could smack of Hinduism, but not the word yoga, and a nationwide debate raged. How would that turn out? And then a last one, workplace questions that describe the many sides of a controversy that took place in Minneapolis, where the airport administration became aware of the fact that there were many Somali Muslim taxi drivers who refused to transport passengers carrying alcohol that was often visible in those bags from duty-free shops. The drivers, who were Muslims from Somalia, explained that their faith did not permit them to transport alcohol. Steve Wareham of the Metropolitan Airports Commission found the issue troubling. More than 85% of the taxi drivers, by the way, at that airport are Somalis, Somali refugees, for whom this is their livelihood. So whose problem is this? Is it the drivers who refuse a fare and then get sent to the back of the line for a 4-hour wait? Is it an issue of religious accommodation? And given the practical concerns of the curbside, where there were so many passenger complaints, refusals had emerged as a serious customer issue. It was Steve Wareham's issue. So how should he approach this? There are many other issues that we could sort of recite, and I'm not going to do that. There are turban issues that have arisen in New York, and the piloting of buses and the MTA. There are the siting of mosques, like the famous controversy over the so-called mosque at Ground Zero that involved Faisal Rouse and his wife Daisy Khan, who had it all worked out, they thought, with the Lower Manhattan Board, and it was to be a Muslim community center that would serve people of all faiths, even an interfaith center, until it was announced in a New York paper that it was to be a 13-story mosque, steps from Ground Zero. And this launched a kind of Stop Islam, Stop the Islamization of America that many of you would recognize from here. So there are many ways in which these issues have come to converge, and they are issues that are our issues as scholars of religion. There are students' issues, whether or not they care to go into religion or not. There are issues that will concern them if they go into education, into higher education, if they run for the city council, if they become involved in any form of commerce in this multi-religious context of ours. So I invite all of us to think about these, and also, if you're interested in case studies, to think about that way of beginning to engage students in the very projects of pluralism and its argumentation. I want to thank you again and apologize for talking too long. And we have about 20 minutes for conversation and questions. Thank you very much.